Hey guys, Justin here with JHart Modelworks coming to you with another video on the Revell 69 Mustang Restomod. We got a lot going on in this video. In this video we are going to be building our engine. We are going to modify our suspension to get the ride height that we want, as well as kick those wheels out a little bit so that they will look a lot better with this wide body kit. We're also going to modify our drive shaft. We're going to modify the chassis so that we can get the engine to sit where we want it. And we're going to do some modifications to both the front and the rear end of the exhaust. Now, other than the engine portion of this video, everything else that we're going to be doing in here isn't really going to be completed work. It's going to be setting us up for future parts of the build. So we got a lot to get started on. Let's go ahead and get the camera flipped around and get to work. Alright guys, this is our 428 Super Cobra Jet engine, which we aren't going to be using. What you see here is a simplified version of Motoboss's Ford Predator engine. This is a highly modified supercharged variant of the Ford Coyote found in the new GT500 Mustang. Now, as I've said, I have simplified this engine, and what I mean by this, Motoboss engines come as separate parts for every tiny little part. This engine is 41 separate files, not counting the 8 for the transmission or the parts you need to print multiple copies of, like all the pins. Now, I've combined the block, the heads, the front plate, the back half of the water pump, the oil filter connector, the air conditioner compressor, and the alternator all into a single piece. This makes it easier to print, everything lines up right, and it's a lot easier to assemble. I've also added a set of engine mounts before printing, which is really just a rectangle running through the block, but it will do what we need and get the engine to sit in the engine bay properly. If you take your parts in your slicing software before you print and you position them so that they touch ever so slightly, they will print out as one solid part. I've done the same thing with the supercharger. The top and the bottom are separate, as is this small part with these two connectors in the front, so I've merged them as well. I'm not sure why, but my printer just will not print this properly. When it's all merged, the bottom always fails, but when we glue it down, no one is going to see this, so I'm going to just let it slide. Now, I don't use many of the pins, but I do use these big ones with the holes. I think they call them bushing pins. Now, I will use about 4 of these. So we're going to take 2 of these, we're going to tap them in some CA glue, and then we'll set them into 2 of the recesses in the valve cover. I won't use all 4 of them, I only need 2 to get the valve cover into position. Now, one of these has a small hole along the bottom edge. That hole is for the oil dipstick. This valve cover goes on the driver's side of the engine. Now, I'm being a little lazy here. I'm going to go ahead and just dip the ends of those pins into CA glue. And once we have some glue on the ends, I'm just going to slide it into position on the heads. The other side works exactly the same, so we're going to move on to wiring up the coil packs. I'm taking a 0.5mm drill bit, we're putting it into a rotary tool, and we're going to drill a hole in each of the indents on the valve covers where the coil packs are. So now we're going to take some 32 gauge black wire, we're going to cut small segments, and then we're going to dip those segments into some glue and glue them into each of the coil pack holes we just drilled. Once we have them all in place, we'll just go ahead and trim them up, and then we can move on to setting that supercharger. So we're going to apply some CA glue to the bottom of the supercharger. And then once we get glue on both sides, we will just set it into position. And when we're done, you can still see the coil wires just a little bit. Next up, we're going to add some glue to the bottom of the engine, and we will glue our oil pan into place. And I often get asked, and yes, I am using a 0.5mm mechanical pencil to apply super glue. We're going to add some glue to the back of the engine where the transmission goes into place, as well as adding some glue to the transmission itself. And then we'll just slide the pin from the transmission into the hole in the back of the engine and make sure everything is seated and lined up properly. While we're back here, we may as well add some CA glue and glue the starter into position. And getting the starter correctly into position was a little fiddly. It took a couple of tries for me to get it lined up right. Next up, we're going to glue in our exhaust manifolds. And now we're going to glue the throttle body onto the front of the supercharger. This little part down on the bottom of the engine, right behind the alternator, is the mount point for the oil filter. We're going to add a little glue there, and then we'll drop the oil filter into place. Now we do still need to add the water pump, but we're not going to do that until we get our pulleys in place. Speaking of the pulleys, Off the Sprue makes a turned metal pulley set specifically for Ford Coyote engines. Now I'm not sure, I think the kit came with 2 pieces of this belt material, but I think I may have lost one. We're going to do the best we can with this piece. So the largest pulley is the crankshaft pulley. It goes in the bottom and it has 2 ribs for 2 different belt paths. We're going to apply a little glue to the hole in the front of the engine, and then we'll just slide the pulley into place. Now, I'm very sorry, the pulley footage for this video is absolutely terrible. Samsung updated my phone, and the new improved version of the camera software only wants to focus on the background. So the pulley set comes with 2 medium-sized pulleys. This one is going on the AC compressor down here. The other one goes up here on the water pump. The first of our small pulleys is going to go right up here as an idler pulley. And next we're going to set our camshaft pulley. Now the final pulley for the inside belt path is going to be the supercharger pulley. So we're going to add a little CA glue up here to the supercharger, and then we will set that pulley into place. Now there should be a tensioner pulley here. I don't have enough pulleys because I lost one. Now I could have 3D printed one, but the pulley and the arm aren't modeled in the 3D files, and I really just wanted to use the metal pulleys only, so I'm just going to skip it. So with all the pulleys set for the inside belt path, we're going to go ahead and glue that belt into place. We're going to start by adding a little bit of CA glue to the very bottom on the inside path of the pulley, and set this belt material into the glue. It's a little fiddly, but you can eventually get it to set. We'll then add a tiny bit of CA glue to the AC pump pulley and wrap the belt along, keeping it nice and snug. Now you don't want any gaps in the belt material. It should not be loose. It should look like a tightened belt. Now from time to time I find that a little CA glue activator helps get this set quicker and makes it a little less fiddly. You can see what I mean here about the pulley footage being really bad. To be honest with you, I'm not even entirely certain which pulley I'm on at this point. I think I may be setting the supercharger pulley. Yeah, that must have been the supercharger pulley. At this point, we're going to wrap the belt to the inside of this idle tension pulley, and then we'll finish off back at the bottom of the crankshaft pulley. So once we have the belt glued back down to the bottom of the crankshaft pulley, we're going to come in with a scalpel and we'll very carefully cut the belt material. The rest of this footage is pretty much just unwatchable. We are going to go ahead and set the remaining medium pulley here for the water pump, and the rest of the small pulleys and the second belt are pretty much just the same process. So when all is said and done, this is what the full pulley setup looks like for our Predator engine. Alright guys, with the pulleys done, we have 3 engine parts remaining. The first is the air cleaner. Now I don't know if this is going to fit correctly under the hood or if I may need to add some custom ducting to tuck it down lower, so we're going to skip that. This tiny piece here is the oil dipstick, and that's getting broken off the first time it gets bumped. Once the body is in place, that will protect that from happening, so we're going to skip that as well. And that leaves us with this piece, the front portion of the water pump where the radiator hoses connect. Now I've drilled the hole at the connection point and added a metal pin to help locate this and reduce the chance of breaking it off. So we're going to add a little CA glue to the pin and set it into place. So as you can see, this sits over a couple of those pulleys, so that's why we held off until now to glue this into place. So this is our completed engine assembly. Now before we can do a lot of what we want to do today, we do need to get the engine in place, but that's going to be a problem. The oil pan layout for this engine is not the same as the oil pan for the original engine, and where this oil pan sits is exactly where the steering linkage is. Now I've looked at a couple of solutions for this. There's about 3. The first would just be to 3D print a dry sump oil pan, which would be a much flatter oil pan. To do that, you'd also need to find a location for an external oil reservoir and an external pump, and I'm not sure I have that kind of space in the engine bay. Option number 2 would be to just smash the size of this part in the 3D slicing software so that it's only about 1/3 of the size that it should be. So it would fit, it just wouldn't quite look right. Option number 3, which is the option we're going to go with, is just to come in here and cut out all of the steering linkage and just get it out of the way. We may come back and fix it later, I don't know, but for right now we just want to get this engine in place. So we are not going to be gentle about this at all. We're going to start off with the spay nippers and our hobby knife, and we're just going to start cutting away all the existing steering rack material. Now we do want to be careful though and make sure we don't cut off the existing engine mounts. Once we have all that cut out, we're then going to come in with our sanders and we're going to clean everything up and get it down to just a bare frame. Now when we test fit the engine, our engine mounts sit right in these small cradles and our transmission sits correctly in the transmission mount, so everything should fit into position and everything's looking pretty good. Okay, so before we do too much more on this chassis, I need to figure out my ride height. As you can see, I've already done some cutting on here because, well, I've already figured out my ride height. But to show you what we're doing, we're going to go ahead and apply some tape just to hold the rear axle into place so that we can do some test fitting. Now, to my brakes, I have gone in and custom added in some spacers. I took a whole bunch of measurements to figure this out, and I've been asked repeatedly about the spacers and if I would sell the spacers, and why I haven't put the spacers up on my website and whatnot. And the reason is these are so custom. On every build that I have to end up using these on, if I'm lowering a height or I'm raising a height or I'm spacing something out, I have to figure out what type of wheel am I using. Is it going to be a male fitment wheel or a female fitment wheel? I like to use the Tamiya style male fitment wheels. How is my chassis configured? Is it male or female? Am I going to have to convert it? So I have to design the spacer to have a hole in it for the Tamiya style wheels, and then have a hole that will go over the existing male style mounts on the axles. I have to figure out how wide these are. It varies from kit to kit. They are not all the same. Sometimes they're 2.8, sometimes they're 2.6. I cannot confidently put these out there and then have you guys unable to use them because they won't fit for your kit. So these unfortunately are not something I can sell. I just have to model them and add them into, with this particular setup, I've gone ahead and modeled them, and I've 3D printed them so that they connect up to my 3D printed brakes. But to use these, I'm going to come in here. You can see there's a lip in here. I want that lip off so that I just have, because this very, very ridge here is 2.8, but the rest of this post is like 2.6. And I need to take some of this off so that these axles will fit. So the rears are straight. I'm not wanting to lower the rear at all. I want the rear to stay at its current height. So this is going to kick my wheels out about 4 millimeters on the rears. The fronts are going to kick them out, I think it's like 3 millimeters, but it's also, these are going to lower by about 4 millimeters. It's going to lower the front end. I may have to make some changes to this, and I may have to reprint these again with only a 3 millimeter drop. We're going to see, because I don't know if I'm going to have enough clearance at 4 millimeters for the engine. Alright, so now the question is, will this engine sit without hitting the ground? And the answer is yes. It is just barely. Alright, so you can see it's not quite on the ground, but it's awfully close. So I will be going with a 3 millimeter drop instead. Alright, so the next order of business is to address the drive shaft. The drive shaft is molded into a single part with the rear axle, and if I set the entire rear end in place, you see the drive shaft doesn't quite meet up with the engine, so we're going to make some modifications. That, and I just really like modifying the drive shaft like this. So the first thing we want to do is separate the drive shaft from the rear axle. Partially just because I like the drive shaft separate, but mostly because I don't want to mess with this while it's still attached. This plastic is incredibly brittle. When I was first test fitting this, one of the leaf springs was twisted, and I thought maybe I would just twist it back. I hadn't even applied enough pressure to really make any change, and the leaf spring snapped. That's okay, because I applied some Tamiya extra thin, set everything into its correct place, and let it cure back up, so it's actually fixed. But I don't want to go manhandling this and break it off again. So we're just going to take a pair of nippers and nip it right off at the front of the pumpkin. We're then going to use our 400 grit sander to clean up all the edges. We want to be sure to clean up this end too. Now we're going to take our dead center tool. I get these from Scale Pro Shop, one of the best $5 I've ever spent, and we're just going to use it to start a pilot hole right in the center of the pumpkin. We're going to do the same to the end of the drive shaft as well. Then we're going to use our 1mm drill bit to drill a hole directly into each one of them. Using some Tamiya Extra Thin, we're going to glue in a piece of 1mm plastic rod into the end of the drive shaft. We can then cut it off with some nippers, and now we have a mount point on the end of the drive shaft. We of course want to drill a matching hole into the end of the pumpkin to receive the drive shaft. Now we should be able to take the drive shaft with the mount post and slide it into place. We're not going to glue it, we're just making sure that it fits and that it turns smoothly. So now we're going to cut off the other end of the drive shaft with our nippers. And when we do, you'll sometimes see that there is an indent or a dimple on the inside right in the center of the shaft. That's actually really cool, means we don't need to use the dead center tool as we already have a pilot started. So we're going to drill out the center of this drive shaft end. We're going to start with a 0.9mm bit. We're going to keep going until we get to 1.6. We're doing that because that's the size of the plastic rod that fits inside my smallest piece of aluminum tubing. Now, I'm sorry, I don't know what sizes any of these tubes are because all of my packaging has been torn up and has ended up getting thrown away, so I don't really know what sizes these are. So once we finish up with the 1.6mm bit, we're going to cut off a piece of 1.6mm rod and we're going to glue it in with some Tamiya Extra Thin. Let's just trim this down a little bit. And we're going to glue it inside our smallest piece of aluminum rod. We're going to go ahead and cut our new inner drive shaft off of the rod. Aluminum is really soft, so you can just roll it under your hobby knife and it will eventually cut free. So we're going to test fit until we find the correct rod that this telescopes into snugly. We're also going to cut our inner drive shaft down a little bit because it is way too long. Then using some metal files, the round one and a flat one, we're going to clean up the inner and outer edges of both the inner and outer aluminum tubing so that everything will slide together nicely. So we're going to lay everything out to get a rough estimate of how much of the outer tubing we're going to need. Now, due to the design of this doesn't have to be perfect. The way it's going to work, it will be adjustable. We just need to make sure that we're close, but not too long. Now we want to clean up the other edge as well. So now we're going to cut the other end off of our drive shaft. This is the one that we modified to fit into our rear axle. We want to cut this off and we're going to modify it just like we did the first one, but we're going to do this in a way that allows it to fit inside the outer tubing. We're going to step through all of our drill bit sizes, and once we're finished drilling it out, we're going to go ahead and clean up the ends with a sander. Again, we're going to glue in a piece of 1.6mm rod. We'll then trim that off. So now we're going to cut off a tiny piece of the smaller shaft. We can then glue that onto the plastic rod that we just glued in place. And that will allow us to glue that into the larger aluminum tubing that we're using for the outer drive shaft. So now we're going to take our two drive shaft pieces and we're going to slide them together, but do not glue them. We're going to do a quick test fit just to make sure that we're in the close ballpark of where we want to be, but we're not going to glue this together until we actually get the engine fully in place in the chassis. Alright, we have our chassis and suspension components painted up for the most part. We have the base colors down. I need to get the engine into the frame so we can finalize the length of the drive shaft. We also want the engine in place because we need to do a lot of modification to the exhaust pipes to get them to line up with the new engine. So I wanted to get the frame painted up so we can get that engine installed. I started with Mr. Surfacer 1500 Black. I used some Mr. Hobby Super Stainless for the gas tank, and for the rest of these frame sections, what we did was we did some Mr. Hobby Super Duraluminum for the base. We then came back with our House of Colors Burgundy Candy from Scale Finishes that we used on the body, and we just painted over it like a candy. But instead of clear coating it like a candy, if you leave it matte, you get this anodized metal finish, which looks really cool. Now that's cool and all, but there's still quite a bit of detail painting we need to do, and that is going to bring us to these. These are just a few of them, but these are the Display acrylic paint markers. They aren't an alcohol-based ink like a Sharpie, they're an actual acrylic paint. They have 3 ranges of these now. There is the basic version, which is basically your black, yellow, red, green, you know, all the basic colors. They then have a metallic range, which has your silver, gunmetal, a metallic black that's really cool. All the metal versions of all the basic colors, stuff like that. I'm not super fond of the gold on that one though. They also have a fluorescent range, but I haven't tried any of the fluorescents yet. I don't have any of those, but I've been playing with these paint markers for a couple of months now, and I am really liking these for detail painting. Now these aren't going to replace my mechanical pencil for the finest detail, but for cleaning stuff up and doing touch-ups, these are really awesome. So you can see we didn't get the cleanest lines in here, and we do need to clean this up. There's also some little things to address, like some suspension, this sway bar, some bolts and whatnot, stuff like that. And that's where these are going to come in really handy. Rather than mask all of this off 100 times and airbrush all of it like I normally do, I'm going to come in here with one of these markers. I'm just going to really carefully touch this up, and when this dries, it looks kind of shiny right now, but when it dries, you can hardly tell the difference. Like there's some right here back in this corner, but once you get suspension components installed, you're not going to see that at all. So these are great for these little touch-ups. Now these have a really fine felt tip on them, so you can really get in here and do some fine detail work with them too. As far as coverage goes, for the most part they cover really good. There are a few exceptions. The black can be kind of iffy. Sometimes it covers well, sometimes it takes a couple of coats. I have found that storing them tip down helps. The white almost never covers. It's very thin and requires several coats. Honestly, most if not all whites are pretty difficult to get coverage with. It's just the nature of white paint. But you can see how well the silver is covering in just the first coat. Now the yellow does pretty good, but it can take a couple of coats as well, and it's not going to do well over this red. So I'm going to hit the sway bar with a bit of the silver first, let it dry, then we'll come back with the yellow. Now I've found if you mess up, UMP Airbrush Cleaner does an awesome job of cleaning this up. Isopropyl alcohol will work as well, but that's going to damage your lacquer paint underneath. While that silver dries, I'm going to go ahead and move on and do some gunmetal over here on these hubs, and then we'll come back and we'll hit it with that yellow. They call this metallic gray, but it's really a gunmetal. They have a metallic black as well. It's like a dark gunmetal. It's a really cool color. So this is one of those Gundam tools that the Gundam guys haven't been telling us about. These can be kind of hard to find. Display products are not always in stock in the US. It's like they ship some over in batches and then everyone has some for a little bit and then they run out and you kind of have to shop around from place to place. Now I've picked these up in a couple of places like USA Gundam Store, Mecha Warehouse, Gundam Planet, and New Type. Most places charge like $3 or $4 for them, so they aren't incredibly expensive, but they are pretty freaking useful if you ask me. Alright, we are back and putting down some of this yellow. It is going to require a couple of coats still, even over the silver. Yellow is another one of those colors that can be kind of hard to get coverage with, but at least it's not turning orange like it would have done over that red. Alright, that yellow is probably dry enough for another coat, and yeah, there we go. That is turning plenty of yellow now. Like I said, this is not an ink marker like a Sharpie, it's an actual acrylic, so it's going to behave similar to like a thin Tamiya in a marker. There we go, chassis is completely detail painted. All in all, I spent maybe about 15 minutes with these markers instead of hours doing multiple different layers of masking and airbrushing all of this. And that's just with me messing around taking my time. With the chassis painted up, the next thing we want to do is install the engine, because until we do, we can't finalize the modifications to the drive shaft, and we still have some serious modifications to do to the exhaust. I like using these glue tip applicators. They're really useful, but the ones I got from Amazon the last time are insanely long and hard to control, so I like to cut these down to make them a lot more manageable. We're going to apply a little bit of glue to both of these mount points right behind the front suspension, and we're going to add just a little bit to the transmission mount back here as well. And then we can carefully drop the engine into place, making sure that all 3 points seat all the way down properly into position. Now from here, we're going to dry fit the rear suspension into place. We will then slide the wide end of our drive shaft into the rear axle. We can then hold that in place with one hand, and using the other hand and some tweezers, we're going to position the other end of the drive shaft into the transmission. We want to set our finger on the joint to hold it steady, and then we can mark with a marker exactly where they meet up. So that is our mark. Now we want to add some CA glue to the inside of the outer drive shaft tube, and then we'll slide the inner portion of the drive shaft right up to the line we just made, just like that. Now, if we did this right, we can set our drive shaft into our pumpkin, we can then set the other end into the transmission, and the rear suspension should just drop perfectly into place just like that, leaving us with a functional spinning drive shaft. Now, we are gluing any of this in place, we still have a lot more other work to do. So with the engine in place, we can measure out where the exhaust needs to be, because when you put the exhaust in place, it will not line up with the new engine. So we're going to start by cutting the ends off. We're going to put down a piece of tape across the exhaust to hopefully get a fairly straight line, so we cut these to equal lengths. But my big head was in the way, so you're not going to see me actually cut them. Now, I have gone in and 3D modeled up some couplings. These are designed specifically for my 1/16 inch solder and to fit on the exhaust tips for this specific kit, so they are pretty specific to this build, but you could do something similar with just some rubber tubing or something. So we're just going to pop a little glue on the ends of the exhausts here, and then we're going to set the wide opening over those ends, so that will have our couplings on. And they don't fit as snug as I would like, but they are close enough for hand grenades and other government work. Next up, we're going to take some of this 1/16 inch solder. This stuff is very soft and flexible. It will hold its shape though once you get it bent. So this will just slide into the smaller hole right here in the coupling, just like that, and this will be our next step of the exhaust. But before we can proceed, we need the chassis seated in the body, and we need the interior tub in place as well. The interior tub contains the lower half of our firewall. We don't want to bend everything up and glue everything into place only to find out later that it's hitting the firewall and nothing will seat properly. And to make sure we get everything lined up properly, we also want to make sure we get these two mount points located properly into position. We're going to use a little bit of tape to hold everything down. We're going to cut a small piece of solder off of the roll. Then we want to get it as straight as we can, so we're going to start by pressing it down with our fingers, and then we can start rolling it under something hard and heavy and flat like a book or this metal Altoids tin. That should be pretty good right there. We're going to dry fit this into place and then mark where we want to make our first bend, making sure that we clear that firewall. We're going to take some round nose pliers. You can find these in the jewelry section of the hobby store, and we're going to gently make a bend. This is just a rough guess. We'll test fit it and refine it a bit more as we go. Alright, that is almost a perfect shot to the exhaust. We know we've cleared the firewall at this point, so now we can take the chassis out and we can set the body aside. With the chassis free from the body, we can come at this from the top now, and we're going to get this seated roughly where we want it, and we can mark about where we want to cut. Now I want to cut it right about here. We're going to give this just a slight bend, and then we're going to cut it with a hobby knife with my big old head in the way. This stuff is really soft, it just cuts like butter. Now, after a couple of rounds of test fitting and cutting, we have it close enough right there. Now I've mangled this one up a bit, which is the downside to being so soft, but we're going to use this as a template and make 2 more. Okay, we've made new exhaust pipes and we've test fit again, and now I'm ready to commit to glue. We're going to drop a little bit on this end and slide it into our connector, and then we quickly need to rotate the other end into position right up against the exhaust header. We're going to give this one just a little bit of a tweak here, and that is going to take care of the front end of the exhaust. Nope, we need to tweak this one too. Now we're done. So the last thing we want to address in this video are these exhaust tips, because those are terrible. Now my answer, of course, was to 3D model a new set of pipes. I can just design these so much easier in 3D than I can scratch build them. Now we want to cut the tips off right in front of the exhaust hangers, and then we're going to test fit our new tips. We can then commit to glue, but be super careful not to get any glue on the body. We do need the body in place though, so that we can make sure that these go on straight. And now that we have our exhaust tips. And now that the exhaust is fully modified, we can go ahead and get it painted up and get it ready to go. Alright guys, we are back in the spray booth. We have the exhaust all painted up, and that is looking really, really nice. So I am out of the Alclad exhaust manifold, which I love to use. So what I did instead, I used the Mr. Hobby Super Metallic Super Stainless Steel, and then I went over it with some Tamiya Clear Yellow and some Mr. Hobby Clear Brown until I got this tone. And it just, there's various tones all over the place, but you kind of want to concentrate wherever there's bends, because that is where you will get the most heat, and that will create your heat staining. I also did some Duraluminum Tough. This is honestly my favorite chrome. Do it over a nice gloss black, and it just comes out really, really nice. Now I would absolutely love to start assembling the exhaust and the suspension and whatnot and just get this going. We are in fact going to go ahead and stop this video here. The reason is that the instructions say not to do the exhaust yet, and you can't do the rear suspension until you do the exhaust. But the reason you want to wait is you want to get the interior completely done, get the interior tub in, and then get the chassis mated up to the body. Because the way this chassis sits, you have to tuck it under that body and get it tucked under that rear valance, and then you can wiggle it and drop it into place. That's going to be exponentially more difficult if you have the exhaust in here. Even before, I pretty much doubled, at the very least doubled, the length of the exhaust tips. Could I do it? Probably. I could probably get away with doing it, but there is a really good chance that I will break the exhaust tips if I do it wrong. So we are going to forego that quick instant gratification in exchange for a much easier build later on. So what we're going to do instead is I'm going to go ahead and wrap this video up, and I'm going to start working on that interior so we can get that knocked out. Then we can come back and finish up getting the body on the chassis, get the exhaust in, get the suspension in, and start moving off into finalizing up this engine bay. So that's going to be it for this video. Thanks for hanging out, guys. I always appreciate you building with me, and I will catch you on the next one.